It was a bright and blustery morning in St. Petrock's Mead, the sort of morning that hinted at spring, but still carried the bite of winter in its breeze. Crocuses nudged through the damp earth by the hedgerows, and in the village square, the bunting left up from the harvest fete fluttered with a stubborn defiance. Life in St. Petrock's moved at a gentle pace, punctuated by gardening hours, post office queues, and the occasional tiff over hedges grown a little too wild. At Lavender Rise, a charming little cottage up the slope from the high street, the newly arrived Mrs. Thomasina Drake was settling into village life with a mixture of wide-eyed enthusiasm and just a touch of affected modesty. She was 34, recently widowed, and always fashionably dressed in pale silks or tweed ensembles that hinted at city money. It was to Thomasina that the event occurred, which would set all of St. Petrock's whispering over teacups and behind drawn curtains. She had risen early to fetch her order from J. Renshaw's bakery, a modest establishment owned and operated by the Renshaw brothers, neither of whom could bake without arguing about yeast. The elder, Joseph Renshaw, was a serious man who spoke rarely and kneaded dough as if it had insulted him. Martin, his younger brother, was altogether different, cheerful, friendly, and reputed to flirt with every widow and spinster in town, including the vicar's housekeeper. It was Joseph who had handed her the bread that morning, wrapped in brown paper and still warm. "Fresh baked. Your standing order, Mrs. Drake," he said shortly, then turned his back before she could respond. She had taken the loaf home, sliced it open with a practiced hand, and there, precisely in the centre, buried, deep within the golden-brown crust, was a ring. Not a trinket or a child's toy, but a real ring, platinum or perhaps white gold, inset with a modest yet unmistakable emerald. It had clearly been forced in before baking. The bread around it was discoloured slightly, the crust warped where the metal had distorted the shape. Thomasina gasped, touched it gently, and then withdrew her hand as though burned. She stared at the loaf, then at the ring, then at the loaf again. Finally, she reached for her telephone. Within half an hour, word had spread like marmalade on toast. By 11 o'clock, the bakery was in an uproar, with villagers arriving under the pretense of buying muffins but staying long enough to ask what sort of establishment baked jewellery into their daily loaves. Joseph Renshaw was apoplectic. Martin, far from alarmed, seemed almost amused. "No idea how that got in there," he said cheerfully to Constable Meadows, who had arrived on his bicycle and was now inspecting the premises with a notebook and an air of poorly concealed excitement. Maybe one of our customers wanted to propose in a very memorable way. Constable Meadows, who had only once before investigated a crime more serious than a stolen hedge trimmer, asked questions, poked at flour sacks, and took statements. But it was Miss Marple, who had come by ostensibly for a seed bun and a chat, who watched the Renshaw brothers closely, her pale blue eyes mild yet curious beneath her veiled hat. "Such a peculiar thing," she murmured later that day, sipping tea in her drawing-room at Danebury Cottage. "To find a ring inside a loaf of bread. One does wonder if it was lost, or meant to be found." As she spoke, her needles clicked together softly, the half-knitted baby booty in her lap slowly taking shape. Outside, the wind stirred the garden gate, and in St. Petrock's Mead, the murder had not yet occurred, but it would, and when it did, everyone would remember the loaf of bread, the ring, and the charming widow who had sliced them open. Miss Marple paused her knitting long enough to place a hand gently on her cat's back, which had settled with a low purr across her knees. She was thinking about the ring, about Mrs. Drake, and more importantly, about the Renshaw brothers. To most villagers, the affair at the bakery had been no more than a delicious piece of gossip, to be folded neatly between a discussion on rose cuttings and the new hymn arrangements at St. Luke's. But to Miss Marple, it was something else entirely. She had seen too many curious things in her quiet years to take such an incident at face value. By the following morning, Lavender Rise had become something of a minor tourist spot among the locals. Women who had never exchanged more than a nod with Thomasina Drake now dropped by with scones or lavender sachets, hoping for a glance at the infamous ring. Thomasina, to her credit, played the part of bewildered hostess to perfection. Her dark hair was always neatly arranged, her expressions pitched perfectly between modesty and intrigue. She showed the ring when asked, claiming that she had no idea what to make of it, and speculating aloud that perhaps it had belonged to a baker's wife long ago and had simply found its way into the dough by accident. Miss Marple, sitting across from the postmistress Miss Hartnell in the tea-room of the Red Tulip, was unconvinced. "Old rings don't simply find their way into fresh bread," she said mildly, stirring her tea as though she were commenting on the weather. "And such a setting, emerald, platinum, it is not the sort of thing one forgets having lost. No, someone knew that ring was there, or wanted it found." Miss Hartnell, who had always found Miss Marple's mind a trifle too precise, chuckled politely and took another bite of currant bun. "You think it's something criminal, then? Seems rather far-fetched. I expect the young man, Martin Renshaw, was trying to court her in some overly elaborate way. He's always been a bit cheeky. You know?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, though she did not sound convinced. "But he gave her the loaf, did he not?" "Oh, no," Miss Hartnell corrected with a wag of her fork. "That was Joseph. Always so gruff, that one. Never did like conversation." Then it was Joseph who handed over the loaf. Curious. She said nothing more, but her mind was busy. If someone wanted Thomasina to find the ring, it meant intent. If it was hidden without Joseph's knowledge, then someone else had inserted it into the dough. And if he did know, why hadn't he reacted more strongly? Miss Marple had seen him at the market stall once, red-faced with fury when a delivery of flour had gone astray. And yet here he had been, merely tight-lipped, even as his bakery became the centre of the village's chattering scandal. The next development came the following afternoon. It was Florence Cotton, the housekeeper at the vicarage, who found the body. She had been returning from a call on her sister in Lower Gransley and took the old footpath behind the bakery, shorter by a quarter-mile, and far more pleasant when the brambles were trimmed. She was halfway along the hedgerow when she noticed something pale near the compost bins behind the bakery yard. At first she thought it was a dropped sack of flour, but as she stepped closer, the truth settled into her bones like cold water. It was Martin Renshaw. He was sprawled awkwardly, his left arm twisted beneath him and his head turned at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open. A faint, congealed smear of blood traced the back of his skull. Florence screamed. Then she did what every self-respecting village woman did in such situations. She ran directly to the vicarage and collapsed in a sobbing heap against Reverend Pointer's waistcoat. Within the hour, Constable Meadows had cordoned off the bakery and was attempting, with much solemnity, to record statements and maintain order. Joseph Renshaw had been the one to identify the body. His face was ashen, jaw clenched, and he spoke only in single-syllable responses. Miss Marple arrived shortly after, invited by the vicar's wife under the pretence of assisting Florence with her nerves. But once there, she made a polite detour along the garden path, pausing near the back gate where the police tape fluttered. She took in the positioning of the body, noted the scrape along the edge of the compost bin, and the faint outline in the dirt where something, or someone, had recently knelt. Her gaze moved from the trampled grass to the bakery's rear door, half ajar, and finally to the open window above, the one that led into the back room where the dough was prepared. The postmistress had said Martin flirted with Thomasina. That was not unusual. Martin flirted with nearly everyone, but had something changed? Had there been some kind of entanglement? And if there had it ended badly? Back in the square, villagers buzzed with speculation. Some said it must have been a robbery gone wrong. Others whispered about love affairs, jealous brothers, and debts owed to men from nearby towns. Still, others suspected poison because it seemed so much more refined. Joseph Renshaw remained silent, shuttered behind the locked door of the bakery. He refused visitors, declined statements, and sent word through Constable Meadows that the shop would remain closed until further notice. The ring, meanwhile, had vanished. Thomasina told the constable that she had placed it in a small velvet pouch, but when she went to retrieve it, only hours after the body was found, it was no longer in the drawer. Miss Marple, upon hearing this detail, said nothing. She simply folded her knitting, placed it neatly in her work basket, and asked, "Do you happen to recall which drawer?" Thomasina blinked. "The one beneath the window, the kitchen dresser. I always keep trinkets there, stamps, matches, spare buttons, and it was locked." "No. I've never had cause to lock anything in this village. I mean, it's not London." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "It certainly is not." It was the simplicity of it that struck her. A ring in a loaf. A young man dead. A locked window above a bakery. And a village full of people far too eager to believe it was an accident. In her sitting room that evening, Miss Marple reflected as the fire snapped quietly. There were motives, certainly, money, resentment, love gone sour. But the ring, that remained the oddest piece. It had drawn attention to Thomasina. It had drawn gossip. And it had disappeared conveniently the moment a real crime was committed. Someone had placed that ring for a reason. Not just to shock or charm, not even as a warning, but perhaps as a message or a lure. She looked out her window, into the dusk beyond, watching as the faint outline of Lavender Rise faded into the mist. The killer was clever. But cleverness, as she knew well, was so often tangled up with vanity, and vanity, like a badly baked crust, always cracked under pressure. The following morning dawned cool and grey, a mist hanging low over the village that blurred the familiar contours of St. Petrock's Mead and lent an air of quiet unease. Miss Marple, as was her custom, began her day early with a brisk walk through the village streets before breakfast. The soft crunch of gravel under her shoes and the distant call of rooks from the churchyard were familiar sounds, yet there was something unsettled in the air, as if the village itself held its breath. At the bakery, a small crowd had gathered, despite the early hour. Villagers spoke in hushed tones, eyes flicking nervously toward the shuttered windows and the sombre figure of Joseph Renshaw standing just inside the doorway. The smell of freshly baked bread, so comforting on ordinary, Days was absent, replaced instead by an oppressive silence. Miss Marple approached quietly, nodding a polite greeting to Constable Meadows, who was stationed at the gate with an expression that betrayed both his respect for the detective and his own frustration at the slow progress of the investigation. "I thought I might take a look inside," Miss Marple said softly. "Joseph, may I?" The baker looked startled but nodded. "I suppose so," he muttered, stepping aside. Inside, the bakery was dim, the windows smeared with flour dust and shadowed by drawn curtains. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, the long wooden table scarred with cuts from years of kneading, sacks of flour stacked haphazardly, and the large antiquated oven that dominated one corner. The scent of yeast lingered faintly. Joseph's gaze was fixed on the corner near the back door where a small pile of flour had been spilled. "Is this where Martin was found?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Yes," Joseph replied, voice rough. "He was out back near the bins." Miss Marple crouched to examine the floor, noting faint footprints in the flour dust, some partially obscured by scuff marks. "These marks," she said thoughtfully, "they appear to have been made by more than one person." Joseph grunted. "I told Constable Meadows that, but he says it's just a mess." Miss Marple shook her head. "It is never just a mess. Not when someone's life depends on it." Her eyes then fell on the half-open back door and the window above it, which was slightly ajar. The window's latch was old and worn, but it held firmly when closed. "Was this window easy to open?" she asked. Joseph frowned. "Yes, it's the only way to air out the dough room in summer. We leave it cracked sometimes." Miss Marple nodded, making a mental note. She then asked about the ring once more. "Joseph, do you recall if anyone else besides yourself or Martin had access to the bread before it was sold?" The baker's jaw tightened. "No one should. But Martin sometimes took the loaves to the shop himself. I don't follow him around." "And the ring in the loaf?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "Have you ever seen anything like it before?" Joseph looked away. "No, and if I had, I'd have been mad as a hatter." Miss Marple rose and moved toward the door, but before stepping outside, her gaze caught on a small scrap of paper pinned beneath a sack of flour. She picked it up with care. It was a torn receipt for a delivery made 2 days earlier from a local jeweler, something about a repair or appraisal. The name was faint but readable. Evelyn Martin. That name struck a chord. Evelyn Martin was a woman well known in the neighbouring town, a reputed expert on antique jewellery, and as the village gossips often said, a woman with a sharp eye for secrets. Outside, Miss Marple found Constable Meadows waiting. "I believe a visit to Evelyn Martin is in order," Miss Marple said, folding the receipt carefully. The constable nodded, though his brows furrowed. "Do you think she might be involved?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Involvement takes many forms. Sometimes a witness, sometimes a helper, sometimes something more." Later that morning, as the village slowly stirred, Miss Marple made her way to the small railway station where a train to the neighbouring town was due. Evelyn Martin's shop was located just off the main street, a modest storefront with a display window crowded with glittering trinkets and the delicate shine of silver. Evelyn herself was a striking woman, perhaps in her late 40s, with sharp features softened by gentle eyes. She greeted Miss Marple with a polite curiosity, immediately inviting her into the cluttered shop where the faint scent of lavender mixed with metal polish. "Miss Marple, I've heard of you," Evelyn said, smoothly, Here on village business, I presume? Indeed, Miss Marple replied. I came regarding a receipt found in the bakery of St. Petrock's Mead. Your name was on it. Evelyn's expression flickered, but she composed herself quickly. Ah, yes, I appraised a piece for Joseph Renshaw, an old ring he claimed had been lost. He brought it to me for repair. And this ring? Miss Marple inquired. The one found in the loaf of bread. Evelyn nodded. Yes, quite an odd story. The ring belonged to his late mother-in-law, passed down through the family. Joseph thought it might have been lost or stolen. When it turned up in the bread, he was baffled. Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. And did you notice anything unusual about the ring when you saw it? Any recent damage, alteration, or marks? Evelyn hesitated. Well, the setting seemed recently adjusted, but that's quite common for rings that age. Nothing to suggest anything sinister, I'm afraid. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Sometimes the smallest alteration holds the greatest meaning. After a moment's pause, Evelyn added, If you don't mind my asking, what brings you to St. Petrock's in the midst of this curious affair? Merely an interest in human nature, Miss Marple said lightly, and a wish to understand why such an ordinary village might hide such extraordinary secrets. With a polite farewell, Miss Marple left the shop, her mind working quietly as she walked back toward the station. On the train back, she contemplated the threads she had gathered. The ring's origin, the tension in the Renshaw family, the vanished heirloom, and now the grim discovery of Martin's body. Something about the entire tableau felt meticulously arranged, as if the murder had been choreographed with a careful hand. Returning to the village, Miss Marple found the streets abuzz with new gossip. The vicar had called a meeting at the church hall, where residents gathered to discuss the tragedy and exchange theories. Some spoke of a robbery gone wrong, others whispered about debts and threats from unsavory characters. But all eyes kept drifting toward Lavender Rise, where Thomasina Drake lived, now under a shadow of suspicion, fueled by the mysterious ring and her sudden arrival in the village. Miss Marple observed the conversations with a quiet smile. The villagers, in their eagerness to assign blame, had overlooked the subtle tensions beneath the surface, the quiet rivalries, the half-hidden resentments, the secrets locked behind polite smiles. She noticed Mrs. Bates, the local grocer, watching, Thomasina with narrowed eyes, and Mr. Collins, the town solicitor, speaking in hushed tones to the rector. Even the cheerful postmistress, Miss Hartnell, seemed unusually withdrawn. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where she poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The village lay peaceful in the fading light, but she knew better than to trust appearances. In her mind, she began to assemble the pieces like a delicate puzzle. The ring was not just a trinket lost in bread. It was a message, a warning, or a key. Martin Renshaw's death was not a random act, but the result of careful calculation. And beneath the calm surface of St. Petrock's Mead, dark currents were stirring. Miss Marple's fingers found her knitting once more, but her thoughts were elsewhere already, weaving together the strands of a mystery that promised to reveal much more than a stolen ring or a tragic death. The morning after Miss Marple's visit to Evelyn Martin's shop dawned brighter. The mist lifted to reveal a pale sun, casting long shadows across the village green. But the light brought little comfort to St. Petrock's Mead. Rumours swirled like the lingering fog, carrying whispered accusations and wild speculation. The village was caught in a restless hush, as if waiting for some inevitable revelation. Miss Marple's routine morning walk took her past the bakery once again. Joseph Renshaw was standing outside, looking pale and worn. His usual brisk demeanor was replaced by a heavy, almost haunted expression. As she approached, he gave a small nod of greeting, but said nothing. "I heard the police have begun questioning everyone again," Miss Marple remarked gently. "Are they making progress?" Joseph shook his head. "No, ma'am. They keep coming." Back to Thomasina Drake. "They say she was seen near the bakery the day before Martin's death." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Thomasina Drake. She has only been here a few weeks, yes?" "Just since spring, but already stirring. Up more trouble than most villagers in years," Joseph muttered bitterly. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She understood how quickly suspicion could settle on the newest face in town, especially when the village was hungry for answers. Yet she felt an urge to look beyond the obvious. Later, as the village buzzed with new theories, Miss Marple made her way to Lavender Rise, where Thomasina lived. The house was a modest cottage with neatly tended flower beds. Thomasina was in the garden, tending to her roses with delicate care. She looked up when Miss Marple approached, her expression guarded but polite. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said softly. "I suppose you've come to ask me more questions." "Merely to see how you are managing," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "It must be difficult with all the talk." Thomasina sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "It is. I never expected to cause such a stir. I only moved here to find peace after a long time away." Miss Marple nodded, settling on a nearby bench. "Peace is often elusive, especially when shadows linger from the past. Tell me, how well did you know Martin Renshaw?" Thomasina hesitated, then said, "We were acquaintances at best. I saw him occasionally at the market or the village hall. I never had reason to speak to him much." "Yet you were seen near the bakery on the day he was found?" Miss Marple asked, her tone neutral but probing. "I was," Thomasina admitted. "I went to collect a loaf of bread. I did not want to cause trouble." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Were you aware of the ring found inside the loaf?" Thomasina's eyes flickered, betraying a momentary surprise. "Yes, it was quite the scandal." "And what do you make of it?" Miss Marple pressed. Thomasina looked down, her voice dropping. "It seems to me the ring was a message, something meant to be found. But by whom, I do not know." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "A message is rarely sent without intent. Tell me, do you have any connection to Evelyn Martin, the jeweller?" Thomasina's brows knitted. "None, that I know of. Why do you ask?" "Only that the ring passed through her hands shortly before Martin's death," Miss Marple explained. "Sometimes the threads of a mystery are tied by people we least expect." Thomasina's gaze hardened briefly. "I have no part in whatever dark business has unfolded here," Miss Marple offered a kind smile. "Of course, but you understand that in such cases suspicion falls like a shadow over many." After a brief pause, Thomasina's voice softened. "I only want the truth to come out, for Martin's sake and for the village." Miss Marple rose, nodding. "As do I." Walking back toward the village centre, Miss Marple's thoughts circled around the growing complexity of the case. The ring was clearly a symbol, but for what? Revenge, warning, or perhaps a key to secrets buried deep. At the village pub that afternoon, Miss Marple found a different atmosphere, one more charged and less restrained. The regular patrons gathered in small groups, debating the case with varying degrees of passion. Miss Marple quietly listened, noting the interplay of alliances and grudges that coloured their words. Mr. Collins, the solicitor, was speaking animatedly about the legal complications that could arise if the true story of the ring and the murder were uncovered. He suggested that hidden wills and disputed inheritances might explain much of the tension. Mrs. Bates, meanwhile, expressed fear that the scandal would ruin the village's reputation, while the postmistress, Miss Hartnell, quietly confided to a friend about overhearing strange conversations late at night from the Renshaw household. Miss Marple's eyes caught those of George Fletcher, the local farmer, who sat apart, his face etched with worry. He was a man known for his straightforwardness, but today he seemed burdened by something unsaid. Later, as Miss Marple strolled toward the churchyard, she found George tending the graves with a quiet reverence. "George," she said gently, "do you mind if I ask about Martin's recent days? Did anything seem amiss?" George paused, leaning on his spade. "Not much, really. Martin was a quiet man, but lately he looked troubled. Said he'd found something that might change things." "What? Kind of something?" Miss Marple pressed. George shook his head. "He didn't say. Only that it was important, and he feared for what might happen if others found out." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "And who might those others be?" George glanced around, then lowered his voice. "The village isn't as peaceful as it seems. Old debts, grudges, and family secrets. There's no shortage of people who might want to keep things quiet." Miss Marple's keen mind noted the weight behind George's words. It was clear that Martin's death was a symptom of deeper, long-standing tensions beneath the village's placid surface. That evening, as the sun set behind the rolling hills, Miss Marple sat by her window, the glow of the hearth casting flickering shadows. She spread the pieces of her growing puzzle on the table before her, the ring, the strained relations within the Renshaw family, Thomasina's ambiguous position, and the whispers of secrets long kept. A sudden thought came to her. The ring's setting had been altered recently. Why? Was it to hide something or to reveal a secret? Perhaps the ring was a signpost, directing attention away from something more sinister. Her fingers traced the outline of the ring's image she had sketched from Evelyn's description. There was a faint engraving, barely visible, that had escaped initial notice. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would return to Evelyn Martin with this new question, and she would speak with Joseph Renshaw again to observe not just what was said, but what was left unsaid. In St. Petrock's Mead, the quiet of the night held its breath, waiting for the next move in a game whose stakes were far greater than anyone yet realized, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence and incisive mind, was ready to see the whole board. The following morning found Miss Marple once again strolling down the cobbled street toward Evelyn Martin's jewellery shop. The shop's small window, usually sparkling with polished trinkets, now seemed more like a display case for the village's collective anxiety. The ring, a small but potent symbol of the mystery that had gripped St. Petrock's Mead, was more than a mere piece of jewellery. It was a key that promised to unlock hidden chambers of deceit and betrayal. Inside, Evelyn was meticulously arranging a new display of brooches, her hands steady, but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease as Miss Marple entered. The older woman offered a polite smile, but said little until Miss Marple broke the silence. "I've been thinking about the ring," Miss Marple began, "and something puzzles me. You mentioned it had been altered recently. Could you tell me more?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "Yes. The ring was originally set with a small, plain stone, but a few weeks ago it was brought back here, reset with a larger, more elaborate gem. The customer was, insistent, almost secretive. I didn't ask many questions, but it was clear the change was important. "Do you recall who brought it in?" Miss Marple asked. Evelyn hesitated. I did not see the person's face clearly, but there was a familiar scent of lavender, like someone from the village, perhaps. Miss Marple's mind flickered to Thomasina Drake, whose garden boasted a wealth of lavender bushes. The connection was tenuous, but intriguing. "May I look at the ring again?" Miss Marple requested, and Evelyn retrieved the small box from a locked cabinet. As Miss Marple examined the ring under the soft light, her fingers traced the delicate engraving around the band, a barely visible pattern of tiny initials intertwined, with an odd symbol resembling a twisted vine. "It's a subtle marking," Evelyn observed, "not something most would notice." "But important to those who understand it," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "Thank you, Evelyn." She left the shop with the ring carefully tucked away, her thoughts already weaving the threads together. The altered setting, the secretive customer, the engraving, all suggested a message concealed in plain sight. On her walk back through the village, Miss Marple decided to visit Joseph Renshaw once more. She found him in the bakery, kneading dough with a distracted air. The shop, usually bustling with customers, was quiet, perhaps reflecting Joseph's own turmoil. "Joseph," Miss Marple began, "I wonder if you could help me with a small detail. Has anyone from your family, or someone close, expressed an unusual interest in the ring found in the loaf?" Joseph paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "No, ma'am, not that I know of, though there's been talk among the family, hushed and wary." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what of your sister, Beatrice? She was quite close to Martin, was she not?" Joseph looked uncomfortable. "Beatrice and Martin, well, they had a complicated history. Some said they were more than friends, but it was never spoken openly." Miss Marple nodded. "Complicated relationships often breed complicated motives." Joseph sighed, glancing toward the window. "Beatrice left the village abruptly last week. She didn't say why." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A sudden departure in the wake of a murder and an incriminating ring suggested deeper currents than the village's polite surface revealed. "Do you know where she went?" Miss Marple asked. "No." She packed her bags and left, saying only that she needed to find herself. As Miss Marple stepped outside, she felt the weight of the silent secrets pressing down. Beatrice's disappearance was more than a coincidence. It was a crack in the carefully maintained facade of St. Petroc's Mead. Determined to follow this new lead, Miss Marple set off toward the small post office. There Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, was sorting through the day's mail. Miss Marple greeted her with warmth, then carefully broached the subject. "Miss Hartnell, I heard you mentioned hearing unusual conversations from the Renshaw household late at night." The postmistress lowered her voice, glancing around before speaking. "Yes, ma'am. I heard voices raised in anger, whispers of threats. It was after Martin was found, but before the police got involved. It sounded serious." "Did you recognize the voices?" "No, ma'am. Two muffled, but one was distinctly male, the other female." Miss Marple pondered this quietly. Arguments and threats hinted at tensions that might have escalated beyond mere words. As she walked back home, the village felt charged, each familiar face shadowed by suspicion and unspoken stories. Miss Marple's mind raced through what she knew the mysterious ring with its secret engraving, Beatrice's sudden flight, the whispered threats from the Renshaw home, and Thomasina's ambiguous role. Each was a piece of the puzzle, yet the whole picture remained elusive. That evening, as twilight deepened into night, Miss Marple sat by her window with a cup of tea. The quiet village lay below, unaware of the slow unraveling of truth. She knew the next step would require delicate observation, a subtle test to draw out the hidden truths. And somewhere in the village, the real murderer watched, waiting to see if their carefully constructed web would hold or finally unravel beneath Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny. The following morning dawned grey and chilly, with a fine mist curling around the village rooftops like a secret waiting to be whispered. Miss Marple, as ever, rose early, her mind already turning over the threads she had gathered in the days since the murder. The village, meanwhile, was restless, caught between the shock of the crime and the uneasy normality that life demanded. Conversations in the market, under the spreading chestnut tree, circled the case with the hesitant tremor of gossip seeking substance. Miss Marple decided that today, more than ever, it was essential to keep close to the pulse of the village's heart, its people. She set out first to visit the vicarage, where Reverend Harold Bainbridge had invited her for tea after the funeral. The vicar was a man of gentle manner but firm convictions, often relied upon as a voice of reason in St. Petrock's Mead. "Miss Marple," he greeted warmly, leading her into a cosy sitting room where the fire flickered softly. "These are difficult times. The murder has shaken us all." "Indeed, Reverend," she replied, settling into a chair. "Yet it is often in the disruption of calm that truths reveal themselves." The vicar nodded thoughtfully. "I have been pondering the nature of this crime. Martin seemed well liked, though, as with all of us, not without his flaws." Miss Marple smiled gently. "You understand well, Reverend, that no one is without secrets, especially in a village such as ours." The vicar sighed. "I heard troubling things recently, whispers of quarrels between Martin and a few villagers, old resentments stirred up anew." "Such things are like embers," Miss Marple mused. "Sometimes they smoulder quietly until the slightest breeze breathes them into flame." "Have you any suspicion, Miss Marple?" the vicar asked with genuine curiosity. "I am gathering pieces, Reverend, though the picture remains incomplete." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Thomasina Drake, her face pale but determined. "Reverend Miss Marple," she said softly, "I hope I'm not intruding, but there is something I must share." "Come in, Thomasina," Miss Marple invited. Once seated, Thomasina hesitated, then spoke. "I couldn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about the ring. I recalled something curious. Martin once mentioned a family heirloom he hoped to retrieve. Something that was lost long ago, hidden perhaps." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "A family heirloom, you say?" "Yes," Thomasina replied. "He was vague but said it had great sentimental value. I wondered if the ring might be connected." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That is a valuable piece of information, Thomasina. Thank you." As Thomasina left, Miss Marple turned to the vicar. "The heirloom might explain the unusual alteration to the ring. Perhaps it was changed to conceal or reveal something specific." Reverend Bainbridge nodded. "And might that explain why someone would go to such lengths, dangerous lengths, to obtain it?" "It could, Reverend." Later that morning, Miss Marple visited the Renshaw household. The family home sat at the village's edge, its neat garden betraying a quiet tension within. Joseph answered the door, his face etched with worry. "I hope I'm not intruding, Joseph." "I wanted to ask about Beatrice," Miss Marple said kindly. Joseph sighed. "She left without warning. No note, no explanation. Some say she's hiding, others that she's frightened. Have you heard from her since?" "No, ma'am. Nothing." Miss Marple's eyes softened. Fear can drive people to desperate measures. Joseph nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else." Before she left, Beatrice spoke of a letter she found, one that suggested the ring was part of a larger secret. "A letter?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but probing. "Yes, she didn't show it to me, but she was troubled. Said it hinted at a hidden past, something someone wanted, kept buried." This revelation deepened the mystery. Miss Marple thanked Joseph and made her way back toward the village square, her mind weaving the new threads into the tapestry. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Dr. Henry Claremont, the village physician who had attended to Martin in his final hours. The doctor's professional detachment was a useful counterpoint to the gossip and speculation. "Doctor, may I ask, did Martin mention anything unusual to you before his death?" Miss Marple inquired. Dr. Claremont thought for a moment. "He was anxious, unusually so. Worried about someone discovering something he wanted kept secret. But he never said what." "Was he alone in his fears?" "Hard to say. Villagers have their rivalries, but I sensed Martin felt betrayed by someone close." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Betrayal is often a motive more potent than greed. As she left the surgery, Miss Marple's steps slowed. The clues formed a pattern. Martin's secret heirloom, the altered ring, Beatrice's mysterious letter, whispered threats, and now betrayal from someone trusted. That evening, the village gathered once more at the Crown and Anchor pub. Conversations were hushed but charged with speculation. Miss Marple listened carefully as voices mingled, the fearful, the accusatory, and the uncertain. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the murmurs. It was Martha Pettigrew, the village gossip, known for her keen ears and sharp tongue. "I tell you, it's all connected to that blasted ring. Whoever wanted it back would kill for it." Miss Marple caught the glint of fear, and something else in Martha's eyes. Something more knowing than mere speculation. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple remained calm, her mind quietly piecing together the puzzle. The ring was the key, but to what? The answer lay hidden not just in objects or letters, but in the tangled web of human motives, jealousy, fear, betrayal, and the desperate hope to protect a secret that could shatter lives. And somewhere in the shadows of St. Petrock's Mead, the true murderer watched and waited, confident that the truth would remain buried. But Miss Marple, patient and unassuming, was preparing to bring that truth to light. The following morning brought a brittle chill, the kind that seemed to tighten around one's shoulders as they stepped outside. Miss Marple, wrapped in her usual shawl, walked the narrow lanes of St. Petrock's Mead with an air of quiet determination. She was well aware that the stillness of a village morning was often the prelude to revelations, and today was no different. Her first visit was to the village post office, a modest brick building that served as the hub of local news and information. Mrs. Barlow, the postmistress, greeted Miss Marple with a wary smile. "You're up early, Miss Marple. Anything new on your mind?" "I was hoping you might help me, Mrs. Barlow. I understand you handle all the correspondence for the village. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Letters, parcels, anything out of the ordinary. Mrs. Barlow adjusted her glasses and considered. Well, there was a letter delivered a few days ago that had no return address. It was marked urgent and was left with me for safekeeping because the addressee wasn't at home. Who was it addressed to? Beatrice Renshaw. She came to collect it yesterday, looking quite flustered. Miss Marple's interest was piqued. Did you get a chance to see what the letter contained? No, I'm afraid not. Beatrice was in a hurry and didn't want to be disturbed. Did she say anything about it? Only that it was important, and she needed to keep it private. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Barlow and stepped outside, the letter now a tangible thread weaving deeper into the mystery. She recalled Joseph Renshaw's mention of a letter troubling Beatrice and suspected this might be the very one. Next, Miss Marple made her way to the village library. The small, book-lined room smelled of dust and leather, a comforting scent to her, and it was often a place where quiet truths were revealed through forgotten volumes and casual conversations. Miss Marple found the librarian, Miss Clara Watts, arranging books on a high shelf. "Good morning, Miss Watts. I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment." "Of course, Miss Marple. What can I do for you?" "I'm interested in the history of the Renshaw family. Do you have any local records or archives that might shed light on their past? Particularly anything relating to heirlooms or family secrets?" Miss Watts nodded. "Yes, we do keep some old parish records and newspaper clippings. Let me fetch them." Minutes later they were poring over a worn scrapbook filled with yellowed pages. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faded photograph of a young Beatrice beside a man who was clearly her father, Martin, standing beside a peculiar chest. "There," Miss Marple said, pointing to a newspaper clipping dated nearly 40 years ago. "It mentions the theft of a valuable family ring, stolen during a burglary at the Renshaw estate." Miss Watts leaned in, intrigued. "I hadn't known about that." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks of memory. It appears this ring, the one found in the Loaf of Bread, might be the same heirloom, stolen long ago." A shiver ran through Miss Marple. Not of cold, but of the realization that the village's quiet past had risen up to wreak havoc on its present. She spent the rest of the morning quietly observing the villagers in their daily routines, noting subtle interactions and guarded glances. At the butcher's shop, she overheard Mr. Gibbs remarking to his assistant about a new customer who had been asking too many questions. "Says he's a historian," Mr. Gibbs said, lowering his voice. "But I think he's looking for something better left alone." Miss Marple's mind raced. Who was this stranger, and how did he connect to the Renshaw mystery? Was it simply curiosity, or something more sinister? Later, Miss Marple stopped by the village school where Beatrice had volunteered as a reading assistant. The children adored her, but the staff seemed wary. "I don't mean to pry," Miss Marple said to Miss Langley, the headmistress, "but has Beatrice mentioned anything about troubles or threats?" Miss Langley hesitated. "She's been distracted lately. Sometimes she seems frightened, but she won't say why. Last week she was upset over a visitor who came asking about the ring, said he was a collector." "Did Beatrice mention the visitor's name?" "No, only that he was persistent and unnerving." Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. The pieces were converging toward someone with a keen interest in the ring, and enough determination to unsettle a young woman like Beatrice. Returning home, Miss Marple found a letter waiting for her on the doorstep, an unmarked envelope sealed, with a splash of crimson wax. Inside was a single sheet of paper, bearing a brief message. Leave the past buried, or more will die. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The warning was unmistakable, its tone chilling. Whoever had sent it was desperate to keep secrets hidden and willing to threaten more harm. That evening, at the village inn, the usual crowd gathered under a weight of tension. Miss Marple observed from her corner as voices dropped and eyes flicked, nervously toward the door. Suddenly the silence was broken by a commotion at the entrance. A man, unfamiliar and unsteady on his feet, entered the room. His eyes darted wildly as he scanned the faces before settling on Miss Marple. "I have something to say," he announced, voice trembling. "Something about the ring, about Martin, and the truth that's been kept from this village." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The mystery was no longer confined to whispers. It was about to erupt into daylight. "Sit down, please," Miss Marple said calmly. Beckoning him over, "Let us hear what you have to tell." The man swallowed hard and took a seat beside her. "My name is Edward Pritchard. I'm a historian, and I confess I have been investigating the Renshaw family for months. But what I found went beyond any history book. There's a secret so dangerous it has been buried for generations." He glanced around nervously before continuing. "Martin Renshaw was not only protecting a ring, he was guarding a truth about the village itself. A truth that some want to keep hidden at all costs." Miss Marple nodded slowly, encouraging him to speak on. Edward's voice dropped to a whisper. "There was a feud decades ago between the Renshaws and another family, the Winthrops. It was bitter, and it ended with a tragedy no one in the village talks about. The ring is a symbol of that feud, a key to unlocking what really happened." Miss Marple's mind raced through the tangled history she had only just begun to uncover. "And you believe the murder is connected to this feud?" "Yes," Edward said firmly. "Someone doesn't want the past unearthed. They want the ring and the truth destroyed." Miss Marple placed a steady hand on his arm. "Thank you, Edward. Your courage in coming forward will help us see this through." As Edward settled down, the village clock chimed, marking the slow passage of time and the deepening of a mystery that entwined history, hatred, and human frailty. Miss Marple understood now that the road ahead would test her subtle art of detection as never before, for in St. Petroc's Mead, the past was not dead. It was very much alive, and it was watching. The following morning dawned grey and overcast, the kind of day that seemed to press down on the village with a quiet heaviness. Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts tangled with the revelations Edward Pritchard had shared the night before. The delicate web of old grudges and hidden truths had become denser, and she knew the fragile peace of St. Petroc's Mead was on the brink of unravelling. After a light breakfast, Miss Marple set out to visit the one person who might shed further light on the ancient feud, the village historian, Mr. Algernon Winthrop. The Winthrops had long been regarded as a respectable family, yet whispers of bitterness toward the Renshaws had circulated for decades. It was time to bring those whispers into the open. The Winthrop estate stood on the edge of the village, a modest manor with a garden that had seen better days. Algernon Winthrop, a slender man with thinning silver hair and a habit of adjusting his spectacles, welcomed Miss Marple into his study filled with dusty tomes and old photographs. "Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure," he said, his voice polite but reserved. "I understand you wish to discuss the Renshaw family?" "Yes, Mr. Winthrop," she replied softly. "I believe there are things about your family's history that have remained unspoken for far too long. particularly concerning the feud and its consequences. Algernon nodded slowly, a shadow passing over his face. Yes, the feud. It's an unpleasant chapter, one the village has tried to forget. But forgetting does not erase the pain, as you have no doubt discovered. Would you mind sharing what you know? Miss Marple asked. Every detail could be important. He settled into his chair and began. The feud began over land rights, a dispute between our ancestors and the Renshaws. Tensions escalated, fueled by pride and old grievances, until one fateful night a tragedy occurred. The death of a young man named Thomas Renshaw, my great-uncle's cousin. The circumstances were suspicious, but no one was ever held accountable. It was hushed up, and both families retreated into silence. Miss Marple listened intently, sensing the undercurrents of guilt and regret in Algernon's tone. And the ring. That ring, Algernon said, was believed to be a family heirloom passed down for generations, symbolizing the bond between the two families before the feud. It disappeared shortly after the tragedy and was presumed lost forever, until it was found in the Loaf of Bread, Miss Marple said quietly. Yes, and its reappearance has stirred old wounds. I fear the past is being used as a weapon once again. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Do you know who might want to reignite these old tensions, or who might benefit from such discord? Algernon hesitated. There is one name often whispered. In the village, Samuel Grayson. He was a close friend of Martin Renshaw, and has long harboured resentment against the Winthrops. Some say his loyalty was never as pure as it seemed. Miss Marple made a note. Samuel Grayson was a man who had not yet come under scrutiny, but his connection to the Renshaws and the feud placed him squarely in the frame. As she took her leave, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Beatrice Renshaw. Her fear, her secrecy, it all pointed to a danger far greater than a mere family quarrel. There was something immediate, a present threat tied to those old wounds. Back in the village square, news of Edward Pritchard's arrival and the impending revelations had spread like wildfire. Faces were drawn, conversations hushed, and the air was thick with suspicion. The village was no longer a quiet haven, but a stage for concealed animosities to surface. Miss Marple found herself in the company of Joseph Renshaw that afternoon, the younger brother of the late Martin. Joseph was a tall, robust man whose sorrow had not yet faded. He spoke with a restrained anger, the kind born of grief and frustration. Miss Marple, I fear we are on the edge of something dreadful, he said. This historian, this Edward, he's stirring up things better left alone. Father's death was tragic, but it was an accident. That's all I'm willing to believe. Miss Marple nodded. Sometimes what seems like accident has roots deeper than we imagine, Joseph, but it's the truth we seek, however uncomfortable it may be. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden shout from the village green. A crowd was gathering near the bakery where the ring had been found. Rushing over, Miss Marple saw Beatrice standing at the centre, pale and trembling, surrounded by anxious neighbours. I found something, she whispered, holding out a small, folded piece of paper. It was worn and creased, as if it had been hidden for years. Miss Marple took the paper and carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was old-fashioned, elegant, and signed with the initials T.R., Thomas Renshaw. The letter spoke of secret meetings, of warnings about trust and betrayal, and a plea to protect the family from those who sought to destroy it from within. It hinted at a concealed will, documents that could change everything. A hush fell over the crowd. The letter was a key, a tangible link to the past and a clue to the present mystery. Miss Marple's mind raced. If this letter were genuine, it could explain the motives behind the murder and the renewed interest in the ring. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of legacy, power, and deep-seated enmity. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the village, Miss Marple stood with Beatrice, Joseph, and Edward. The mystery had moved from whispers to undeniable evidence, but the question remained: who among them was willing to kill to keep the past buried? Miss Marple knew the answer lay not in the letter alone, but in the subtle clues hidden in human nature, gestures, glances, and the secrets people told without speaking. And as the village of St. Petrock's Mead held its breath, she prepared for the moment when the true story would come to light. The evening descended slowly upon St. Petrock's Mead, the village lights casting a soft glow on the narrow lanes and the faint silhouette of the church steeple. The letter from Thomas Renshaw was still in Miss Marple's hands, its aged paper delicate but weighty with implication. The gathered villagers had dispersed, leaving a tentative hush over the square, as if the village itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Miss Marple's mind was alert, piecing together fragments she had gathered in the past days. The sudden appearance of the letter, the ring found hidden in an everyday loaf of bread, the uneasy silence of those closest to Martin Renshaw, all signs pointed toward a story layered with deceit and concealed motives. Beatrice Renshaw lingered nearby, pale and uncertain. Miss Marple turned to her gently. "You must be feeling the strain, dear, but you are quite certain this letter is genuine?" Beatrice nodded, biting her lip. "It was hidden in the back of an old Bible Father kept locked away. I found it by accident while cleaning the attic. I don't know why he kept it secret or what he feared." "Secrets often guard more than shame," Miss Marple murmured. "They protect fears, grudges, sometimes even guilt." Just then, footsteps echoed on the cobblestones. Joseph Renshaw approached, his face drawn but resolute. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking about that letter. If my father hid such things, it could mean there's more at stake than we imagined. The family's reputation or something even more." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "It may explain the urgency behind Martin's murder." The word hung heavy in the air. Joseph looked toward Beatrice, his sister's eyes wide with fear. "We need to find these documents, the will, whatever he spoke of in the letter. If they exist, they could unravel this entire mystery." Edward Pritchard, who had been silently observing, stepped forward. "I have access to some old village records. Perhaps I can help locate the documents. The parish archives may hold clues." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A wise plan. The past rarely stays buried in places like St. Petrock's Mead." As the group made plans to meet the following morning, at the parish archives, Miss Marple found herself drawn to one figure who had remained unusually quiet, Samuel Grayson. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something unreadable. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. The quiet solitude offered her space to reflect. She carefully examined the letter again, noting its phrasing, the careful choice of words, and the hidden urgency behind Thomas Renshaw's plea. It suggested distrust within the family, a warning of betrayal by someone close. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. At the parish archives, Edward Pritchard began sifting through dusty ledgers and brittle documents, while Miss Marple, Beatrice, and Joseph searched for anything that might corroborate the letter's claims. Hours passed, the silence punctuated only by the occasional rustling of pages or the scratch of pen on paper. Suddenly, Edward's voice broke the quiet. "Here, I've found a will. It's dated 5 years before Thomas Renshaw's death. It mentions a codicil, an addition, that seems to revoke a previous inheritance." Miss Marple looked over his shoulder. The document was dense with legal language, but clearly altered something significant regarding the family estate. More importantly, it named a beneficiary who was not the expected heir. Joseph's jaw tightened. Who was it? Edward hesitated. A woman named Lydia Merton, a name not spoken much in the village these days. The name stirred a faint memory in Miss Marple's mind. Lydia Merton had been a servant in the Renshaw household, dismissed under vague circumstances years ago. Few knew what had happened to her after she left the village. Beatrice's voice trembled. Could she have been the cause of all this? Was she involved somehow? Miss Marple shook her head. Not necessarily, but her sudden appearance in the will suggests she was important to Thomas. Perhaps she knew something, or held a secret. There. Investigation was abruptly interrupted by a hurried knock on the archives door. Constable Harris entered, his face grave. "There's been another incident. Samuel Grayson was found unconscious near the edge of the village. It looks like he was attacked." The group exchanged worried glances. The quiet tension in the village was escalating into something dangerous. Miss Marple rose steadily. "Then, we must see him at once." At the modest cottage where Samuel was recovering, his injuries appeared superficial, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "They warned me to stop asking questions," he whispered. "Someone doesn't want the past unearthed." Miss Marple knelt beside him, speaking softly. "Who did this, Samuel? Do you know?" He hesitated, then said, "I suspect someone within the village, someone with much to lose." As the day wore on, Miss Marple pondered the threads weaving. The story tighter, the letter, the hidden will, the attack on Samuel, and the mysterious Lydia Merton. Each clue brought new layers to the mystery, but also new dangers. Later that evening, she visited Beatrice and Joseph at the Renshaw estate. The siblings were visibly shaken but determined. Beatrice confided, "Father must have hidden more than just documents. He knew this secret would tear the family apart." Joseph nodded grimly. "And someone was willing to kill to keep it quiet." Miss Marple looked out the window toward the darkening village. "Secrets, grudges, and silence can be deadly, but truth, once uncovered, can bring healing, if we are brave enough to face it." As the clock chimed softly in the quiet house, Miss Marple knew the next steps would be critical. The village's tangled past was close to boiling over, and she must tread carefully to unmask the true culprit before another tragedy struck. The night air was crisp, carrying whispers of old stories and new dangers. In the heart of St. Petrock's Mead, the hunt for truth was far from over. The dawn crept softly over St. Petrock's Mead, washing the village in pale light that seemed hesitant, as if uncertain about the day ahead. The past weeks had left the village suspended between unease and curiosity, a fragile balance Miss Marple sensed could shatter with the slightest disturbance. The events were closing in now, tightening like the strands of a spider's web, and she knew the moment to unravel them was near. Miss Marple sat by the window of her cosy sitting room, the morning newspaper unopened on the table beside her. Her keen eyes traced the patterns of activity in the village below, the baker's cart rumbling down the lane, children gathering for school, and the occasional figure wrapped against the chill, moving purposefully through the square. It was the ordinary hum of life that made the village's dark secrets so unnerving. Her thoughts returned to the letter from Thomas Renshaw, the hidden will naming Lydia Merton, and the recent attack on Samuel Grayson. Each event was a piece of a larger puzzle, one involving old betrayals and carefully concealed motives. And yet, one essential element was still missing: the true reason behind Martin Renshaw's murder, the catalyst that had forced buried sins into the daylight. Her reverie was broken by the soft knock at the door. It was Constable Harris, holding a small, carefully wrapped parcel. "Miss Marple, this was found near the riverbank last night. Thought you'd want to see it." She took the parcel with quiet gratitude, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a faded leather-bound diary. The edges were worn, the leather cracked with age. A small brass clasp kept it shut. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This could be the key. "Where exactly was it found?" she asked. "Near the willow tree by the river, where Samuel was attacked. Seems like someone tried to hide it there." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Constable. This may shed light on things." With the diary in hand, she hurried to the Renshaw estate, where Beatrice and Joseph awaited. They gathered. In the study, the air thick with anticipation, as Miss Marple carefully opened the fragile book. The pages were filled with neat, looping handwriting, entries dating back many years. Thomas Renshaw's voice emerged from the past, recounting family tensions, mistrust, and a shadow that had hung over the estate for decades. The diary spoke of a long-standing feud with a distant relative, a dispute over property and inheritance that had never been resolved. More importantly, it mentioned Lydia Merton, not as a servant dismissed in disgrace, but as a trusted confidant who had helped Thomas during troubled times. A passage caught Miss Marple's eye. "The trust I placed in Lydia is my only solace. Should anything happen to me, the truth must come to light, though I fear the cost will be great." Joseph's voice was tight. "He feared someone in our family, didn't he? Someone willing to go to any lengths." Beatrice shivered. "But who? And why would they kill Martin over this?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Because the secrets Thomas guarded threatened the foundations upon which some have built their lives. When old grievances remain unresolved, they often fester into something far more dangerous." As the siblings absorbed the diary's revelations, Miss Marple's mind turned to the villagers, the quiet figures with their whispered suspicions and veiled glances. One person in particular had remained elusive: Harold Finch, the village solicitor. His calm demeanor masked a sharp intellect and a knowledge of every family in the village. If anyone knew how to manipulate the past to protect the present, it would be him. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple arranged to meet Harold at the village hall under the guise of discussing legal matters related to the Renshaw estate. As they settled into the small office, she observed his expression carefully, steady, but with a flicker of something guarded beneath the surface. "Harold," she began softly, "the Renshaw family has been through quite a storm. It seems the past is proving difficult to escape." He nodded slowly. "Old families often have old secrets, Miss Marple. But I assure you, my involvement has always been to protect the integrity of the estate." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet sometimes the desire to protect can blind one to the damage caused." She paused, watching him closely. Did you know about the will naming Lydia Merton as a beneficiary? Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. The will was complicated. Thomas changed it several times, and not all versions were legally binding. I handled the last official version, which excluded Lydia. Do you believe Thomas's earlier wishes had merit? Miss Marple's tone was gentle but probing. I cannot say. The family disputes muddled the situation. But I did find Lydia's sudden involvement suspicious. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So you think someone might have had a reason to erase her from the picture? Harold's glance flickered, but he remained composed. In matters of inheritance, many motivations exist. As the conversation deepened, Harold inadvertently revealed a detail, a meeting between Thomas and a local businessman, Edmund Calvert, mere weeks before Thomas's death. A meeting shrouded in secrecy and dispute over land development near the village. Miss Marple's curiosity sharpened. And what was the nature of this dispute? Harold hesitated, then replied, Calvert wanted to buy a portion of the estate to build a factory. Thomas was reluctant, fearing it would change the village's character. This added a new dimension to the mystery. Had Edmund Calvert's ambitions collided fatally with the Renshaw family's legacy? As Miss Marple left the village hall, her thoughts raced. The layers of the mystery were peeling back. Family grievances, legal maneuvers, and now external threats to the village's peace. The attack on Samuel, the concealed diary, the disputed will, all pointed to a desperate attempt to control the narrative. That evening she confided in Beatrice and Joseph. We must meet Edmund Calvert. His role could be pivotal. Joseph agreed reluctantly. I've never trusted him. He's always seemed more interested in profit than people. Miss Marple nodded. Profit can be a powerful motive. The following day they travelled to Edmund's office at the edge of the village. The man was brusque, his sharp eyes flicking between them as they presented their inquiries. He admitted the land dispute but denied any involvement in the murder or intimidation. I wanted the land, yes, he said. But I'm no murderer. This village needs progress, not old grudges dragging it down. Miss Marple studied him quietly. Progress, if it destroys the fabric of a community, can be a curse. Edmund's jaw tightened. You can say that again. As they left, Miss Marple felt the pieces were close to fitting, but someone was still hiding the final truth, someone whose desperation to protect their secrets had turned deadly. That night, as the village settled into uneasy slumber, Miss Marple sat by the fire, piecing together the human puzzle, motives rooted in love, greed, fear, and betrayal. The ring in the loaf of bread, the hidden will, the attack on Samuel, the diary's revelations, and Edmund's ambitions, all threads leading toward the heart of the mystery. Tomorrow, she would confront the village with what she had learned. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, knowing the final revelation was near, and the true nature of human frailty would soon be laid bare. In the gentle flicker of the flames, Miss Marple saw clearly. In St. Petroc's Mead, the past was never truly past, and only by facing it could the village find peace once more. The morning air was crisp as dawn broke over St. Petroc's Mead, but beneath its calm surface, tension pulsed quietly through the village. Miss Marple had gathered the key players once more in the parlour of the Renshaw estate. The siblings Beatrice and Joseph, Constable Harris, Edward Pritchard, and even Harold Finch. The diary, the disputed will, the recent attack on Samuel Grayson, and the land dispute with Edmund Calvert all hung in the air like a delicate web waiting to be drawn tight. Miss Marple stood by the hearth, her gaze sweeping the assembled faces. This story began with a letter, Thomas Renshaw's plea to be heard after his death. It has led us through shadows of family distrust, forgotten promises, and hidden motives. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But there is one who sought to silence the truth forever. All eyes turned as she continued. Samuel Grayson was attacked because he uncovered what some wished to remain buried, and Martin Renshaw's murder was the tragic consequence of desperate fear. She turned to Harold Finch. Your calm and measured demeanor masked a sharper purpose. You knew of the changing wills, the hidden meetings, and the disputes over the estate. But it was you who feared the loss of control more than any other. Harold's composure faltered for the briefest moment. I was only protecting the family's legacy. But at what cost? Miss Marple's voice was steady but firm. You forged documents to exclude Lydia Merton, who Thomas trusted. You threatened Samuel when he questioned your actions, and when Martin began to piece it together, you silenced him. Beatrice gasped, Joseph clenched his fists, and even Constable Harris looked taken aback. Harold rose slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of exposure. I only wanted to preserve what was rightfully ours. The factory would have ruined everything. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Preservation by deceit and violence is no preservation at all. As the constable moved to take Harold into custody, the village outside seemed to breathe again. The secrets had been brought into the light. The shadows lifted. Beatrice stepped forward, voice trembling but resolute. Thank you, Miss Marple. You've restored not just justice but hope to this family. Miss Marple smiled softly. The truth has a way of healing wounds, if we have the courage to face it. As the group dispersed, the first rays of sunlight warmed the village, promising a new beginning for St. Petrock's Mead. The past, though painful, no longer held power over the present. And in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate balance of human nature, the frailty and strength woven together in every heart, and the quiet triumph of truth patiently uncovered.